محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق الأجمعين باعث الأنبياء والمرسلين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا حبيبنا حبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. أما بعد. Brothers and sisters, inshallah, with the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we over the next 10 days will be aiming to discuss, or trying to discuss rather, the most pertinent issue that we currently face. If I was to pose a question to yourselves, respected brothers and sisters, and that question was, what is the most pertinent issue we have in modern society? What would you say the answer to that is? If the question is, what is the most pertinent issue in modern day society, what would you say the answer to that is? The answer to this question is in the question itself. Understanding and establishing what modernity is. Understanding and establishing what modern society is. Understanding and establishing what we mean by this era that we're currently living in is going to give us the solutions that we strive for. So the discourse, inshallah, that we are going to have over the next 10 days is trying to examine and trying to understand what modernity truly is. What this era is that we're currently living through, and what do we mean by when I refer to something, in the words of René Guénon, that is called the crisis of modernity. So we speak of modernity very positively, do we not, brothers and sisters? Whenever I say something is modern, or whenever I talk about modernity, this is almost a synonym for something positive, yes or no? If, for example, I say this individual is of a modern outlook, we say this is something positive. This individual is modern, this is something positive. In Farsi you would say پیشرفته, correct? اگر من بگم مثلا کسی پیشرفت کرده، این چیزی مثبته یا منفیه؟ کاملا چیز مثبته، بله یا نه؟ So if we understand this notion, then we move forward and try to say, where did we come to understand this, right? So we've come to some sort of dichotomy here where there is this war against traditionalism, I think it's fair to say, and there is this striving towards modernism. But is this as good as a thing as we're making it out to be, brothers and sisters? Is this a good as a thing that society is making it out to be? Or are there certain principles of the traditional school of thought that we need to abide by? And maybe, just maybe, brothers and sisters, all the issues that we're currently facing in society is underpinned by the fact that we are trying to fit ourselves in this mold of modernity. Because at the end of the day, we need to live in current day society, yes or no? And we need to be Muslims as well. So if we need to be Muslims and we need to live in modernity, we need to see if modernity complies with Islam or if modernity flies in the face of it. And if it does, then we need to look for some sort of alternative in regards to how we can live our life. The reason I say that there is a discrepancy between the two schools of thoughts is because we can see various traditions. مثلا, if we look at Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He states what? A very, I would say, ma'roof saying that most of the brothers and sisters come up to me with when I talk about living in a traditional manner, is that we must raise our children in accordance to whose time? Our time or their time? Their time, correct? So when Imam Ma'soom is saying that our children need to be raised in accordance to their time, not our time, we understand that there needs to be some flexibility in regards to how they are raised. There needs to be some flexibility in regards to how their upbringing is. However, now this is, we can say, a vote for quote-unquote modernity. What about traditionalism in this instance? We have a tradition from the same Imam himself where he is saying that us, in this life, we are nothing but travelers. And he divided human beings into two major categories. He said category number one. Category number one are a group of people. And this group of people, they have sold their soul for worldly pleasures, all right? Let's put one category of people there. Now what about the second category of people? They said they purchased their soul for an eternity of solace. And when one reads the Nahj al-Balagha, and when one reads the traditions of this Ma'soom, you are quite against a life of luxury, of modernity, and of this material wealth. So our crisis is thickening, is it not? Trying to understand, how do we as Shia Muslims, how do we as humans fit in this mold of modernity? So now, for example, if we have Shia TV shows that are broadcasting a certain rhetoric, if we have Shia YouTube channels that are broadcasting a certain rhetoric, if we have, for example, Azadari that are broadcasting certain rhetorics, we are now trying to bring the message of Islam into 2024, correct? So while we bring the message of Islam into 2024, to what extent does this liaise with modernism? And to what extent are we cutting away the legs of Islam by trying to express ourselves as modern Muslims? It's an important question, is it not? To what extent are we actually taking away from the integrity of Islam? From what extent are we actually taking away from the value of Islam simply to put on an exercise, simply to express ourselves in a manner that would make us seem more popular, more accessible, or more what any of the other words that you can use that will be filling our 10-part series? So that's the question that we aim to answer, inshallah. I don't have much longer with you. They gave me 20 minutes for the talk. So I just wanted to open up the muqaddamat. I just wanted to open up the introduction and let us know that the purpose of our discussion is this: how and to what extent can Islam live in the modern world? Because we have issues now that we have never faced before. Correct? When we look at the issues now, did they exist at the time of Rasulullah? Instagram, social media, internet, conduct, shows, all of these things didn't necessarily exist at the time of Rasulullah. So as I said, is there a certain frame which we can fit ourselves in, or is modernity simply a mold that is not compatible with the religion of Islam? And if it is not, to what extent do we go back to traditionalism while making sure, as Amir al-Mu'mineen stated, we raise our children according to their time rather than ours? That's the question that we are trying to answer. And in the modern world, brothers and sisters, as we all know, we have outsourced everything, correct? When we need food, we have Uber Eats. When we need clothes, we have Amazon Prime. When we want to exercise, we go to the gym. Everything is outsourced. For example, if you go back a few hundred years, everything was holistic. Everything was Tawheed-like, one could say. Everything was interconnected, all aspects of life, right? There were animals you would eat. There was agriculture and you would farm. There were plants and then you would make your clothes, so on and so forth. There was this interconnectedness of nature, correct? However, now we've extrapolated it all and we've outsourced everything. Now we need to try to see where we as individuals fit in this. Is this a correct model, or do we need to bring everything back into a whole, into a holistic model, so that we get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because we are facing problems, brothers and sisters, are we not? We are facing problems at the end of the day. Why do we not feel closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is my ibadah not of that sincerity? Why can't I, for example, after doing these a'mal, feel that spiritual proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I should be feeling? Could we blame the society within which we live? Or do we blame the model that we are living in? So inshallah, our analysis on modernity and our quote-unquote war on traditionalism will continue on the following 5 fronts. So when we look at what modernity actually means, that's the first part of the premise, correct? When we have a discussion, the first thing we need to do is actually define what the actual hal is. So when we look at the definition of modernity, what are we actually looking at here? That's the first thing we need to ask ourselves. We throw the word around very casually, very freely. However, what does modernity actually mean? When we look at what modernity actually means, we say it's a cultural, philosophical, and social phenomenon that is marked by radical change, correct? No one can put aside the changes made by modernity. No one's going to turn around and say that the internet took us backwards, for example, technologically. Or electricity took us backwards technologically. Or the combustion engine took us backwards technologically. However, when I talk about developments, and I use this word specifically, I am not necessarily talking about progress. We conflate the two. When we see a development in one instance, we say this is progress. What does progress imply? Something improved. However, if we look at the religion of Islam, as I stated, everything is holistic in the religion of Islam. When we talk about progress, we talk about a kulli progress, not just one juz of progress. Everything needs to improve. So if we say, for example, something has been a progression, then we say that there has been a total improvement of everything. But if there's just been an improvement in one certain strand of ilm, then we can't say that that is progression in its entirety. So concluding our discussion and just putting an end to our definition of modernity, I would say modernity, if you were to take something away from today's bahth, is defined by 5 major components. How many components? 5. So if we look at the 5 major components, respected brothers and sisters, of what it actually means to be modern and what modernity entails, they are the following. The first is rationalism in the modern world. What is it laced with? It's laced with an air of rationalism. Number 2, what do we have that defines the modern world? Individualism. This is something very succinct to what we're looking at here. When we look at the third one, what are we defining modernity as, or the modern world as? Globalization. When we look at the next one, we see it's industrialization. And the final one is secularization. Don't worry too much about the distinctions. We're going to go through all of them one by one. But I just wanted to introduce some sort of muqaddimat in regards to what actually marks the modern era. It's these 5. Individualism, industrialization, rationalism, secularization, and globalization. When we have these 5, then we can understand that modern society and modernity itself is epitomized by these 5 main points. So now I will offer a sentence or two for each of the 5 points, and then inshallah, I will take your permission to leave. Number 1, modern society is marked by what? Who can remind me what the first point was? Point number 1 was modernity is marked by rationalism, correct? Rationalism is what? Rationalism is that we state that our intellect is the only source of true knowledge. Where did this come from? Nothing is in a vacuum, brothers and sisters, correct? That's one thing we need to understand. Nothing has arisen just out of thin air. Where has this motion been carried by? Where has this momentum been brought forward to? How do we actually understand that rational inquiry and intellect and rationality is the only true objective measure for ilm? Where did this come from? We can take it back to many instances, but I would say the most impactful one was the Renaissance. When we look at the Renaissance in Europe, we would say that this is the front runner for those who are trying to state that intellectual reasoning and rationality is the basis of ilm itself. And we can only know if we can have empirical evidence for it. So I can offer many discourses on the subject. However, I think the best place we can understand where this thinking came into play is by the words of an individual called René Guénon. So René continues when he's talking about the Enlightenment. He says that the Enlightenment, the word is very fancy, correct? The Enlightenment. He says it refers to a birth of many things, but in actual fact, it was the death of many things. As I said, modernity, we have this positive connotation to it. But if we reanalyze the actual origins of modernity, we would see that it's quite the contrary. In what sense? He states it wasn't so much the birth of many things, it was more so the death of many things. He stated, the purpose of the Renaissance was what? To bring the Greek and Latin civilizations back into fruition, correct? The era of Socrates, the era of Plato, the era of Aristotle, these works, they wanted to be brought back into a Renaissance, which is a noble endeavor. No one is saying that this is something problematic. However, what is problematic? René continues. He states that how did they go about bringing back to life the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates? All they had was the base text. So they got the base text and they read what was on it, took away all of the zahir and left all of the batin. And he said that when they reduced ilm from its major principles simply to what's on the zahir, we have the materialism that we are facing today. That's how he defines the modern world. He states that when we look at how this actually came into play, it's a negation of true principles, it's a negation of the batin, it's a superficial understanding of the religion, which he describes as a veritable monstrosity. Strong words, huh? A veritable monstrosity, he states. A simply zahiri understanding of ilm, and we've moved forward to it. Brothers and sisters, are we not guilty of this ourselves? In the religion of Islam, we're talking about the modern world, but let's look at ourselves as Muslims. Are we not guilty of this ourselves? Do we not simply read the Zahir and try to implement on that without true understanding of the principles that stand behind them? This is exactly what happened in the modern world, and this is exactly what happened in modern society. So the issue that we have with looking at simply rationality as a cause to live by is that everything is measured by what? Everything is measured by its utility. At this point in time, we have no understanding of anything else. Everything is simply measured by what? Its utility. For example, I'm sure many of you have been traveling and many of you have been over the world. If you have seen buildings from 100, 200, 300 years ago, what do they look like? Magnificent, no? The architecture, the building, the glass, the framework, beautiful. Why? Because they weren't just acting upon the superficial concepts of utility. They were reunifying them with underlying principles. However, what do we do now? A consequence of rationalism is that everything is utility. Just make an apartment building with as many houses as you can. Just make an office block with as many offices as you can. Everything is now steeped into utility. Now, this can be very problematic from a Shia perspective, from an Islamic perspective. So if we're going to say rationality is an underlying concept of Islamic thought, then how do we say this is against Islamic teachings? And how do we say this is against Islamic principles? So we're going to conclude on the Shia perspective on rationalism itself, and we will look at the 4 other components, inshallah, with tawfiq, tomorrow. Does Shia Islam speak about rationality? Does Shia Islam speak about using the aql? Of course it does. It's essential to the religion of Islam, is it not? We need to use the aql in order to understand the usul al-din. Our very first invitation into aqa'id, our very first invitation into tawheed, our very first invitation into the Islamic sciences is by rationality. So I don't want this argument that's saying those of the traditionalist school of thought are trying to put forward a lack of rationality. Absolutely not. We believe in the concept of the aql, and at this point we do not differ with modern society. However, we say that spiritual intuition is not limited to it. That's our only difference. They say all ilm is limited to intellectual inquiry. We say that we have ilm from higher sources that transcend the aql itself. When we have the Quran, did the Quran come from an aql? No, the Quran came from a higher source. When we look at the Torah, did the Torah come from the aql? No, the Torah came from a higher source. When we look at all of these divine interventions, they did not come from the aql. We need to use our aql in order to interpret them. However, all of knowledge and ilm itself is not limited to that matter. And this is what unfortunately leads people to intense isolation and selfishness. Correct? When we look at and when we try to diagnose the issues of society today, what issues do we see? We see selfishness and we see isolation. Everybody I speak to, almost everyone, they are talking to me about the isolation that they feel, mostly in Western societies, correct? I'm not saying now the Eastern societies are now ma'soom. They face it to a degree. However, the more I come to this side of the ocean, what do I find? I find that there's deep isolation. There's deep loneliness. What is this a result of? This is a result of this. When one thinks in this manner, which is more closely linked to individualism, which we will come to, a natural byproduct of this is loneliness, and a natural byproduct of this is self-centeredness. Correct? However, in the religion of Islam, what do we preach? Do we preach self-centeredness or do we preach the ummah? Again, we're going to touch upon this tomorrow in individualism. However, when Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, Allahumma salli speaks about the ummah, this is what he is speaking about. He is preaching against individualism. He is preaching against total rationality, because it leads to self-centeredness and it leads to isolation, which then drives us into the depths of depression and we move away from the religion of Islam. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet and the Ma'asumeen tell us to do something, there are very deep psychological implications behind it. However, inshallah, if we have the tawfiq, we will continue our discussion tomorrow in regards to what modern society has to contribute to man, what the crisis of modernity is, and how us as Shia Muslims can liaise our current situation with how we can best attain kamal and spiritual fulfillment. Tomorrow we will conclude the 4 other points that hallmark modernity, and we will start with our first chapter, which is the impact of technology upon the religion of Islam. Wa akhir da'wana walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali tahir.